Welcome to the Post-Capitalist Workplace podcast, hosted by Anuradha, a leading accessibility strategist supporting organizations of today to become organizations of the future. In Season 1, we'll explore what accessibility truly means at its core, as well as the crucial role it plays in decolonizing organizations. While Season 2 spotlights real-world examples of impactful accessibility initiatives and why they're key to addressing some of society's biggest challenges. Welcome back, everyone. Anuradha here. I'm really excited about today's episode for the Post-Capitalist Workplace. Today's episode, as you'll recall, I'm going to be diving into the realities of the workplace, naming some of the barriers and systemic issues that keep certain types of workers, certainly from historically marginalized groups, from fully realizing their potential in the workplace. Some of these barriers are there well before they enter the building for work. They might be as part of the hiring process, part of systemic issues that prevent even from the application process, prevent people from applying on jobs, and so on. So there's just so many layers to this. A couple of key points to keep in mind before we get going. There may be some new terms for you here. That's okay. I highly recommend keeping your own working glossary or notebook of ideas to keep track of this. And this can even be an audio clip or a digital note-taking situation as well, whatever is going to work best for you. I also want you to keep in mind the things I'm discussing here, the list that I'm going to be giving here is not exhaustive. This is a scattering of the data, and I've tried to assemble it in a way that makes logical sense. But keep in mind, I'm an ADHDer, so I'm generally able to see trends and patterns, and I've organized, maybe not in a linear way, but in a web-style fashion. So I hope you're going to be able to keep up with me. More so than a list, I'm going to be providing you glimpses of what it looks like, what it really feels like, the kind of snapshots of what might be happening underneath. You know, if we just dig a little below the surface, what we might be seeing, you'll see the storyteller arcs come through. Let's not forget some of the data that I'm going to be sharing here is not intersectional. The way it was gathered is not. And just as a reminder, if you don't know what intersectionality is, no worries. That is a definition that came from Kimberly Crenshaw. And here's my working definition: a framework for understanding how multiple social identities such as race, gender, class, sexuality, and ability intersect and create overlapping systems of oppression or privilege. And this is really crucial. This could be a key word for you later on, but sometimes they're only collecting data on racialized people, but they're not looking at the gender component, for instance. So when we're thinking about these gender identities and the racial identities, it's like an intersection that both things can be true and they overlap with each other. And the place where they intersect, that intersection, is where the impact of both their gender and racial identities collide. And specifically, Kimberly Crenshaw created this term for Black women. And generally, I prefer that we stick to that. And in the context of this, it makes sense that some of the people we're going to be talking about here who are impacted by this won't just be impacted by one of these laws or one of these scenarios. They might be impacted by multiple. And the way the data is often collected and put together, they're not going to reflect that. So we have to do a little bit of investigation and reflection to see what it would look like if we had multiple identities, because people like that do exist. For example, myself. So how do we make sure that we are collecting these data and being a faithful narrator to this? And how do we interpret what I'm sharing here? What does that look like in terms of lived experience? And how do we start to use this to inform better choices? I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next episode, where I'm going to be giving you glimpses of what the post-capitalist workplace could really look like, where I hope to take people. But for today, just keep this in mind. And some of the data and stories I'm finding are just from the US or the UK or a specific group. Let's keep in mind that sometimes we will then have to pivot this data to include other people and to show that this piece of data is not in isolation with any other piece, but they are working together in many instances. So those are the caveats from me. I'm going to do my best to share some of the notes in the show notes, and I'll do my best to remember them all. You're always welcome to reach out to me if you have citations or if you need me to try to find citations for something I'm sharing. I'm going to do my best to do that. Okay, so on to the rest of the episode. The way I've structured these, as I said, they're not necessarily in like alphabetical order or a linear order. They're just little segments, little pieces that we can use to start piecing together what the scenario really looks like. So the first group of statistics is even before we're thinking about working age people, we're thinking about way before. So we're going to rewind to these core things that might be happening. And we'll be starting with homelessness. So if we don't have a home, if we're houseless, then what happens? Well, that makes it very difficult to apply for jobs, obviously. Not having an address and the stability of a home certainly can make things more tricky. But when we look at the statistics around who tends to be the most impacted by homelessness, two of the top categories are foster children. So children who have, for whatever reason, lost their parents or any relatives who can look after them, and they are being taken care of by foster parents in the system. A lot of times they will age out of the system and they will have very little support and given very little long-term support on how they can take care of themselves. Another large group of people who are homeless are LGBTQ children. So once their families or caregivers find out about their LGBTQ designation, they might not feel as warm and welcoming to these children. And then they are often thrown out of their houses with very little support again. The other two groups that might fit into this are people with mental health challenges or domestic violence survivors. So none of these groups of individuals, like once again, we might have statistics on one or two, but it's very possible for someone to be in many of these categories, as we can see. So what happens then? And without the idea of a stable address and all that comes with the house that we can call our own, a bed, the wardrobe, the ability to take a shower and get changed and feed ourselves and all of that. Without that, the lack of stability makes it very difficult then to even think about getting a job and even think about applying or having the correct clothes or the bus fare or a ride to the interview, the technology to charge your phone or a device so they can apply. Most jobs are all online these days. The application process is all online. So without regular access to these things, these individuals are going to struggle to find employment. And if they get through that process, then what happens when you have to fill out the onboarding process paperwork, your employee paperwork? You often need to fill out these details, like an emergency contact, like your phone number, like your address, and so on. So many times, homeless people, when they're at an encampment, they are raided. There's sweeps that will happen. And a sweep would be some place where they will bring the police or other individuals to basically take all of these encampments, the possessions, their tents, anything else, and throw them away right in front of them. This does it not solve the problem of homelessness, people will lose their most valuable possessions. And the few possessions they do have, not only are they meaningful, they're probably important. And think about that. If your social security card or your passport was among those documents, then will be additional barriers to being able to get employment. Another piece of this is a healthism, or the postcode lottery, so-called postcode lottery. There are several social determinants of health. This might be a new term for you, but these are the things that impact our health and our well-being through life. And there's plenty of research around this. They are things like our parents' educational status, the availability of certain types of food. It can be the postcode or the zip code that you are growing up in. There are certain markers for the wealth of that area. Most of these things are not in our control. Very little of these things are in our control. So if you live in a food desert, or if you live in an area that has been historically redlined, meaning that certain neighborhoods were segregated many decades ago, and that stigma remains. So certain people will live in certain parts of a town, and that determines so many things, like the ability to borrow money, the ability to qualify to go to a good school. And that will have a knock-on effect on so many of these things. So once again, these are not in someone's control. And another piece of this, once again, these weave together. This is not in isolation, that intergenerational and colonial trauma are still things. So say like you were intergenerationally had times of houselessness or food insecurity. That's going to have a knock-on impact. If you grew up in a country where colonial trauma was a thing. And remember, racism doesn't work in one direction. It doesn't work in one silo. There are the three pillars of racism. So the way it impacts people of a certain place in the world matters greatly, of who their colonizers were, what the exact methods of colonialism were. Was it taking land away? Was it enslaving people? Was it creating a difference in people through propagation of war or inferiority? Because these are some of the tropes that still remain. You can see that that would have a huge impact, especially because people would have grown up in that, and that would have changed the culture, the family system, and so many other things. And then instead of just the strengths and possibly lineage of that we're passing down, we're also passing down trauma. They did a study where they looked at a specific type of worm for over so many generations. And the first group was exposed to some stress. The genes, meaning the way our DNA is read, is through a process called epigenetics, meaning what's in the environment right now at any given moment. That could be your nutritional status. It could be your stress. That could be how much sleep you're getting. It could be, so many things. If you're living in a place of stress, this is going to have a knock-on impact. And so these worms were exposed to stress. And then several generations later, the DNA of what was being expressed, even 17 generations later, was still impacted by that initial stress response in the first generation. So if we're thinking about colonialism, yes, human lifespans are a bit longer and we don't have these kind of longitudinal studies, unfortunately, but we can see how easily that colonial trauma and other types of violence or intergenerational wounds can carry through for many generations. And that doesn't necessarily mean only negative things. It can indicate there's a resilience and that the nervous system is more geared for dealing with stress. But it also, plenty of studies show this as well, these microaggressions or other things that tend to happen in life around us. Ask any disabled person or racialized person or so on, gendered person, a gender minority, for instance, and they will share some of the microaggressions that they have been putting up with their whole lives. And it might be for myself, the assumption that I'm going to be a natural caregiver and take care of everyone. It might be that I'm supposed to be the smartest person in the room and be really good at math or whatever, or making fun of me for, I got this as a child for being Hindu. So whatever it is, those have an impact on the health and well-being of us as well. So those are all encoded in us as part of this trauma. And this is not even beginning to touch some of the more trauma with the T, with the lowercase t. Trauma with the capital T can be things like racism and so on. It can be colonial violence. And if we're also thinking about trauma with the little t, doesn't make it any less important. But these microaggressions, domestic violence, some of the other things I mentioned, those are traumas nonetheless, and they have a deep and profound impact. And they can manifest in so many ways. It might make it very difficult to be able to be employed or be understood in that same way. Another thing, names. A few studies have been done on this relatively recently. Individuals with a Nigerian name in the UK had to apply for 90% more jobs to become employed. And that statistic was slightly lower if people had a Pakistani sounding name. So the prejudice of the name itself also impacts this. When we think about names, it's such a key thing. It's like one of the first words we learn in association with ourselves. And when naturally that creates bias in people, that makes it difficult. So I know some people will change their names or pick more westernized names, and that's a solution, but the bias remains nonetheless. This also impacts trans individuals that sometimes, depending on when they would have transitioned, or trans or non-binary individuals, that their IDs might not match the name and the documents that they go by. Because of that whole thing, depending on when they transitioned, there is not a lot of research on things like this, to be honest. But the lack of information here tells us, and the lived experience of so many trans and non-binary people, is clear that that can be a barrier, a significant barrier to applying, because their experience certificates, even their ID, might not match the name they use now, making it very difficult to verify their experience, and that might impact pay, benefits, and the approval generally for them to work for an organization. So those are just a sprinkling of the issues. And as I said, these impact us even before we got through the door. Now let's go to a few of the more systemic pieces from capitalism. So most people don't have a working knowledge of capitalism. That's not necessary. I'm going to give you little tidbits here and there. Of course, if you want to dig in deeper, Sowing Post-Capitalist Seeds is a resource that I can always recommend, which it's a course that I teach that has 21 contact hours. But back to what we're talking about here, the high-level capitalism that we need to keep in mind here is, first, feminized labor. So feminized labor, not necessarily the labor done by women, but often it is. It's often done by women and gender minorities, but it can be done by anyone. This is not related necessarily to gender or sex, but it typically does fall along those lines. Everyone who is raised under patriarchal conditioning will probably have felt this or seen this to one degree or another. This feminized labor can be things like childcare, care work in general, weaving, cooking, all of this work that is done in the so-called private sphere of the home. At some point, our peasant counterparts many centuries ago would have had time for all of these tasks, and those would have been done by all sorts of people who it was needed for. However, through the advent of capitalism has really focused on creating propaganda through the elite and the media and indoctrination to highlight difference. So in this case, we're talking about difference based on gender or sex being exploited to the point where people are not then paid equally for that labor. The labor done in public being much more valued, and the labor done in private, meaning we're not, at least I haven't seen this very often, people being paid to do chores in their own home. And there's a lot more nuance here that I'm not going to have time to get into if I want to keep this to one episode. I think we're going to probably end up going into 2 episodes with this because I have so much to say. But even a 2 household income, we still need someone to do the work at home that relates to cooking, childcare, clothing. And when I say weaving, a lot of the work, especially for Northern Europeans, was to clothe people. And the work behind that was often done by women or gender minorities. And it took a significant amount of time to make sure people had clothing to wear. So all of these jobs are not paid for under capitalism. And capitalism really couldn't function if that domestic labor wasn't being done by somebody. And oftentimes people call that the second shift. So women in the workplace bear the brunt of this, especially those who are mothers, have to come home and work at this. And once again, this often does fall along gender lines. The next piece is privatization of land and housing. So previously there would have been common spaces. Now we have very few common spaces where we're not expected to pay any money to exist. And that could be the sidewalk. That might be a parking lot. That might be a library. There's very few of these kinds of spaces that we can hang out without needing to spend any money or do anything to perform any sort of labor for a right to be there. What happened is those commons were privatized by the wealthy. And that means people who would have had access to food and water, and if they had no property of their own, they could set up a house or a dwelling on the commons, and they could get firewood and they could do all sorts of things. There are still parts of the world that have these areas that water is publicly available, and there's no such thing as a water bill. But most of us don't have that in the Western world and the global, quote unquote, global north anymore. We don't have that opportunity because of this. I also mentioned that part of capitalism is exploiting difference, and colonialism fits into this as well, that there was significant propaganda campaigns and divide and conquer strategies that were part of this. That means they're exploiting difference of race. The definition of whiteness came out of colonialism, came partially from the US and partially from the royal family and so on in the UK, and then was exported all around the world. Countries like South Africa, they have taken the worst of racism and brought them all to bear in that area, and especially pre-apartheid South Africa. So these are some of the bigger implications that impact us. We have to work for our rent or mortgage. We have to work to cover our bills that didn't exist a few generations ago. And we have to do labor for ourselves, which we always had to do, but we had significantly less work to do, meaning our peasant counterparts had plenty of time to raise their own food or tend animals or so on the commons. They didn't have to pay rent for any of that. They didn't have a water bill, and they had much more time off, especially in the quieter parts of the year where there's not a lot of harvesting going on. They had time to do the labor that was necessary for them. They had plenty more rest time. We don't have those luxuries. And one of the things of capitalism, especially when we're talking about feminized labor, is before that, both, let's say, a heterosexual couple, but in this example, with a family, then they both got wages and they both worked, and then they both performed household duties to some degree. Through this exploitation of difference through gender, the wages would come to the man, and then the kind of private work done at home, the domestic labor, wasn't compensated. So this is how difference was exploited. The first unions, as it were, this is not quite an apt analogy, but the guilds were often open to anybody. However, at some point in history, through these propaganda campaigns, women were not allowed in the guild. And presumably, though we don't have data about this, other gender minorities. And I can assume once colonialism happened, then racial minorities, people of the global majority, racialized people, were not accepted into these guilds as well. So we can see the difference and how that's exploited and how certain types of propaganda campaigns or laws are privileging one group over other groups. Hi, yes. So I'm recording this after I've recorded the episode. It's going to be split into 2 episodes. So you've listened to the first half. And I want to give you a reminder to go slowly here. In the next episode, we'll continue this. But it's really important that you allow this tension to be with you. Instead of trying to break the tension with laughing or whatever, if you can stand to sit with that discomfort, it's really going to be important, because from that, we can then start to think about taking action. But right now, we need to acknowledge the gravity of the situation without looking away. That is one of the biggest tools in our tool belt, is to sit with this discomfort, sit and listen and witness stories of these barriers and lived experience. So while you're in this spot before the next episode comes out, I urge you to journal or reflect, maybe listen to some lived experience stories. Maybe you learn and listen to different people's stories and understandings. Maybe you reflect on your own experiences and how uncomfortable you have felt in your workplace or in previous workplaces. And not with an air to fix it and tie it up with a nice, neat bow and fix it, but to be with the reality without turning away. And then we face it again with fresh eyes in episode 5. Thanks so much for being here. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Let's connect and continue the discussion on our website.